Begin with a shadow on steel. It is not black, not truly, but a gray so dark that lamplight slides along it like rain. The surface ripples, not like waves on a summer shore, but like the memory of waves, the pattern left when metal is folded, and folded again until the lines themselves seem alive. Smiths say a Valyrian blade remembers. They say the steel is stubborn and will not be forced, that its shapes and shadings settle where they please. In the hands, a sword like this is lighter than you expect. It moves before you think to move it, yet it never feels fragile. The edge is there, cold and constant, and it does not tire. Dark Sister is such a blade. The craft that made it is gone. When the doom fell on Valyria, the forges burst and the city died, and the secrets of making new Valyrian steel went with them. In the centuries since, the greatest armorers have done their best imitation. They can take an old sword and rework it, adding a tint, a new hilt, a whisper of pattern where once it was plain. But the heart of the work, the sorcery that lets iron drink the sun and stay keen, has been lost. Even attempts to color the metal answer to their own logic. Reds darken into blood. Some folds refuse any color at all, as if the blade knows what it is, and does not care to be told otherwise. That is why these swords hold a realm's attention. They cannot be made. They can only be found, inherited, or taken. There are not many left to be found. People speak of thousands across the world, yet within the 7 kingdoms perhaps 200 survive. That number is not a census, but a mood. The sense of scarcity that makes Valyrian steel into an ideal. Great houses count their fortunes by their lands, their vassals, and their blades. The Lannisters once had a greatsword named Brightroar, but it was lost when a king in their line tried to reclaim the secrets of Valyria and never returned. In the years after, Lord Tywin tried to buy this kind of prestige. Lesser lords were happy to wed their daughters to Lannisters. They would not part with their old swords. A Valyrian blade is more than a weapon. It is a bloodline made visible. Proof that a house survived long enough to keep what others could not take. Dark Sister occupies a special place within that world of iron and memory. It is not the throne-bearing greatsword Blackfire, which kings carried to proclaim their right. It is the leaner weapon, meant for quick hands and precise work. In Targaryen lore, the two are siblings, a pair that together say, "Here is the crown, and here is its enforcement." Dark Sister's earliest known owner was Visenya Targaryen, elder sister and wife to Aegon the Conqueror. She was tall, austere, and exacting. A woman who believed a realm is safer when the law carries a point. She rode Vagar. She ruled by reminder. When words did not persuade, she let steel speak. Already a paradox emerges. This blade appears most often not with peacemakers, but with enforcers and disruptors, men and women who either keep order with severity or reject order on their own terms. A king might speak softly with Blackfire on his back, trusting the weight to do the talking. The one who wears Dark Sister tends to say little, then cut through the tangle. If blades carry legacies, what legacy does this one impose? And why do the most formidable Targaryens keep finding it in their scabbards? The question sharpens when we place Dark Sister alongside Blackfire at the moment the dynasty begins to split into many minds. After Aegon died, his son Aenys took the crown, gentle and eager to be loved. His brother Maegor, born to Visenya and bred for war, stood beside him. Aenys made a show of unity and gave Blackfire to Maegor, saying his brother was more fit to bear their father's sword. Maegor accepted the greatsword and took it as confirmation of his worth. He also already had Dark Sister. Visenya had given it to him earlier. A mother's gift matched to a son's nature. Yet from that day forward, he carried only Blackfire. Dark Sister hung on the walls of his chambers at Dragonstone. That single choice tells us something about both blades. Blackfire is theater and throne. Maegor wanted the realm to read his intent from across a hall. Dark Sister does not announce itself from a dais. It acts. In Maegor's hands, it became a spectator, witness to a reign that prized terror over law, a rule enforced by a crown's weight rather than a clean cut. If Dark Sister remembers, it watched and waited for someone better suited to its line. The first shift after Maegor's storm casts the sword toward princes made for motion. Tradition places Dark Sister next with Balon Targaryen, remembered as Balon the Brave. Balon was a creature of speed and will, a rider who loved the direct path and seized it. Whether handed by a king or claimed by a need, the blade in his hand aligned with his nature. Balon's line matters because it breeds Daemon, and Daemon is the name that fixes Dark Sister to its mystique. Daemon Targaryen is often remembered as a man who took what he could hold and dared the realm to deny him. He was at once prince and pirate, husband and threat, loyal to his own vision of a just order. In the Stepstones, he made war with deeds, not arguments, carving footholds with his dragon and his sword. Dark Sister, long and quick, matched the way he fought. It suited a man who chose the ground, struck first, and dressed victory as legitimacy. With Daemon, the blade left royal halls for stories told on decks slick with spray, and in castles that tasted smoke, and with each story its reputation darkened and deepened. This first chapter is not Daemon's tale. It is about what kind of instrument Dark Sister is, and why it seems to follow a current in the blood. The steel offers a clue. The ripples show 1,000 foldings, each one driving strength into the grain. The color settles where it chooses, avoiding bright costume. In the hand, the blade is lighter than expected, quicker, more intimate than a two-handed proclamation. Carry it long enough, and you begin to think with it. Person who wants to set a line, to draw it clean and dare others to cross, will favor a sword like this over a showpiece that bends the shoulder and stalls the wrist. Valyrian steel makes a promise most weapons never keep. Its edge holds. Its balance endures. It is not an heirloom as burden. It is an heirloom as advantage. That promise shapes decisions. When a lord or a prince trusts his cut will land, he is more likely to trade warning for action. Over decades, that choice becomes a habit of governance, then a reputation. Houses that cannot buy such blades will not sell them. Even a man like Tywin Lannister, his power counted in wagons of gold, could not pry a Valyrian sword from a minor house that would rather marry down than give up the one thing that proves it still matters. In that light, Dark Sister is not only a Targaryen relic. It is a text we can read. Return to Visenya for a moment. She did not smile for effect. She understood that peace can be maintained by certainty. When she founded new institutions, or enforced old ones, she used both dragon and steel to make the consequences clear. Dark Sister at her side changed the air in a room. It was not an ornament. It set a tone. When we speak about her, steel-backed statecraft, we are not speaking in metaphor. She made the law a visible edge, and that choice echoes down the blade's lineage. After Maegor, with Dark Sister waiting on a wall, the kingdom learned the cost of ruling by spectacle without the support of craft. Fear can build a road quickly. It can also collapse it without warning. The later trajectory of the sword, from Balon's brisk command to Daemon's restless ambition, shows the edge reborn not as symbol, but as strategy. These were men more interested in where a line was drawn than in how it looked from a throne. Then we have Brynden Rivers, who will come into focus later in this series. For now, note the contrast. Bloodraven was not a man for long speeches. He preferred to know first, to position second, and to draw last, and to do it in a way that ended arguments. Dark Sister in his hand signals continuity with Visenya's philosophy and with Daemon's decisiveness, yet it adds a new quality. Secrecy. The blade passes from a queen who enforced law in daylight to a prince who made war in the open, then to a spy master who believed most fights are best won before anyone notices they began. The same weapon, the same steel that refuses a bright stain, moves naturally into shadow. All of this raises the question that will carry us forward. If a blade can be a thesis, what argument is Dark Sister making about Targaryen power? The evidence suggests a chain. Authority, to be real, must be enforced. Enforcement, to be trusted, must be personal. When enforcement fails or becomes theater, challengers will appear, and they will take up tools that can answer swiftly. Dark Sister is not a crown, and it never tried to be. It is the thing that makes a crown believable when compromise ends. This matters beyond names and years. Think about the map. The 7 kingdoms are a quilt of older loyalties stitched together by conquest and marriage. In such a place, legitimacy is never just law. It is performance, memory, and the ability to end a dispute when words fall short. Valyrian steel serves that need by being incorruptible in practice. It does not bend badly. It does not fail in the moment a prince needs it most. Fewer than a few hundred households can claim such assurance. And one of those blades lived its most active life with Targaryens, who were anything but gentle. That is the paradox you should hold. There is one more piece to settle before we go. The open loop this series will close is the sword's disappearance. We know it lived a long time in the light. We know which hands held it, and why, and where it turned battles into statements. Then we know it was carried into the cold, where even the best forged edges can be swallowed by fog and time. It is not enough to say it vanished. We will follow the trail to its vanishing point, to the moment where maps end and stories begin, and we will decide which stories fit the facts and which are wishful shadows. Before we take that path, we return to the first grip. Picture Visenya strapping on a blade that moves like thought. The scabbard is plain and the hilt is simple, with only the ripples in the steel for adornment. The queen does not look at it when she enters a chamber. She does not need to. Others do. They see the echo of waves along the edge and imagine what it means to face a woman who believes the law is alive, a thing that breathes and bites. From the first room to the last drift of snow, one thing stays constant. Dark Sister turns presence into consequence. What, then, is Dark Sister really? It is a test. If you carry it, you show the realm what kind of Targaryen you are. If you meet it, you learn what the Targaryens believe power is for. The Conqueror's sister answered with order. Her son, the Cruel, answered with show, and left the blade idle. The princes who came after answered with action, sometimes righteous, sometimes reckless, always swift. And in the end, a man of secrets answered by vanishing with it, into a space where questions outnumber witnesses. We will not race to the end. Stories like this breathe better when we take them slowly, step by step. In the next part, we will walk with Visenya through quiet corridors and along the walls of newly raised keeps, and we will watch a sovereign use a sword, not for glory, but to make promises no one can mistake. Only then will we understand why Dark Sister seems to favor the dangerous, and why that preference altered a dynasty's fate. Visenya Targaryen enters this story the way a sharpened line enters parchment, leaving a mark that guides every cut to come. She is the first famed hand to claim Dark Sister, the sister queen whose presence could still a hall without raising her voice, whose blade did the rest when voices failed. She was a warrior as Aegon himself, trained beside him since childhood, silver-gold hair braided tight for the field, a long Valyrian sword at her hip that never looked ornamental. The chronicles call her stern and unforgiving. Rumors say she played with poisons and shadowed craft. Her dragon, Vhagar, spoke in thunder. Yet it was Visenya on foot, without a wing beat to announce her, who taught the realm how close power could stand. For all the grandeur of conquest, for all the cities that bent when dragons darkened the sky, kingship is argued at arm's length. It is settled in corridors where no dragon's head can fit, at council tables where a glance can quiet 3 lords faster than any gout of flame. Visenya understood that, and Dark Sister was the language she used when words were no longer enough. The sword itself is a study in her taste. Blackfire, her brother's great blade, is a broad pageant of a weapon, the kind a crowned figure raises above a kneeling crowd. Dark Sister is different. It is lean, swift, a Valyrian longsword balanced to live in a duelist's hand. It implies movement rather than ceremony. It carries the possibility of sudden change. Visenya's governance took shape where dragons could not reach. She walked the half-built halls of the new royal seat above the black water, her boots caked with red clay, Dark Sister on her hip, like another tool of state. Aegon named her to oversee the Red Keep's design beside his hand, Lord Alan Stokeworth. At court, they joked that the king sent her to the works to spare himself her steel stare on Dragonstone, and if it was a jape, it still spoke a truth. He trusted her with foundations. Stone could be argued into upright obedience if someone stood there long enough to make it listen. Visenya stood there. When the hill was a maze of pits and tunnels, she moved through the trenches with the calm of a commander on a field of battle. She did not rely on the awe of a dragon circling overhead. She relied on her presence, the quick flash of a dark blade when a point needed drawing, and the iron belief that systems fall into line when someone will not yield. In the histories, one story makes her method plain. Aegon had said he was safe. They were walking alone, so the tale goes, with the wind off the bay, the king easy in his person. The conqueror of 6 kingdoms, confident that fear itself stood guard. Visenya drew Dark Sister quick enough that there was no time to think, and the king touched his cheek and found his fingers wet. It was not a wound to end a reign. It was a lesson. Had she been an assassin, not a wife, his blood would have been his last. This was how she argued. The founding of the King's Guard followed, not as a flourish of chivalry, but as a policy written in the smallest cut a king could accept. Visenya's steel did not console. It clarified. She made the idea of protection tangible by proving how easily a throne could be reached. Swords as symbols often become banners, but Dark Sister resists that. It does not announce a new era at a coronation the way Blackfire does. It patrols antechambers, stands at a ruler's shoulder, and makes the space around that body behave. That is why the sword suits Visenya. She was not the queen who charmed halls with laughter. That was her sister, Rhaenys, bright companion of singers and puppeteers, who spent more time in the high blue with Meraxes than either of her kin. Visenya favored a straighter line. She trained, she watched, she enforced. The histories say the king spent far more nights with Rhaenys than with Visenya. No one mistook which sister could quiet a captain with a glance and a tilt of her blade. Power is not always loud. Sometimes it stands 3 feet away and lets you do the math. There is an older frame for this. A custom carried out of old Valyria and flown like a standard invisible to most Westerosi eyes. The Dragonlords wed brother to sister. They kept their line within flame and blood. When Aegon took both sisters to wife, he did not bend to the faith or to Andal ways. He carried forward a principle of isolation that reads today as arrogance, but in the Dragonlord's world it was a form of control. Visenya embodied that logic. She did not care to be understood by the kingdoms they had bridged with fire. She cared that the bridge held, and that those who crossed did so in the correct order. Her marriage was a statecraft that placed proximity and loyalty above comfort. Her sword was the same. It made closeness count. It demanded the posture of order. On campaign, the difference between dragons and steel was not an abstraction. A keep can be burned, a fleet can be set alight, but the moment after fire is always human again. Someone has to walk through the ashen gate and declare what comes next. Visenya liked that step. She was as comfortable in ringmail as she was in silk, and Dark Sister made more than a silhouette at her side. It intervened, not always by drawing blood, sometimes by existing where everyone could see it. The blade's rippled dark shimmer, worked by forges that no living smith can match, carried a promise that needed few words. No common fire can melt such metal. That was proven in a later rite, when the Conqueror's sword Blackfire lay with him on a pyre and rose from ash darker, but unharmed. Steel like that answers to a different set of rules. Visenya knew it. She lived by certainty, and there is no clearer certainty than a weapon that does not wear out. Dark Sister, too, is Valyrian steel, light for its length, honed beyond what ordinary edges can hold. It favors the fighter who trusts speed, angle, and intention over brute strength. It seems made for a hand that prefers to slice a way forward, instead of break through by weight alone. In this it reads as an heirloom of temperament. Visenya's governance was the same. She rarely thumped a table when a small measured act would say more. The way a cut you barely feel at first can speak louder than a broad stroke that everyone survives. That is not softness. It is precision in the service of power, and it gave the early court a definition of what enforcement looked like. From then on, when Dark Sister was present, the kingdom understood that latitude had narrowed. The blade also carried an unspoken promise about succession that did not flow through laws or Septon's ink. It flowed through a mother's hand. In the 25th year after the conquest, on Maegor's 13th name day, Queen Visenya placed Dark Sister in her son's keeping. It was no ritual gesture, no airy blessing smoothed by doves and candles. It was a choosing that said as much about the giver as the boy who received it. Maegor had been trained, of course. He had grown sturdy, with a core that liked the feel of steel and the pattern of drills. But this was more than a gift. It was a bequest of ethos, a matrilineal engraving of her will upon his future. In a house that guarded blood with the ferocity of dragons, a mother's mark could become a fate. Visenya wrote in the only language she trusted. Dark Sister did not crown Maegor. It prepared him to enforce rule. In those early years, the boy learned what the blade demanded, how it moved, and how little it forgave a careless wrist. He also learned the kind of rule his mother believed would be needed. The realm they built was young, yet its loyalties still followed old riverbeds. A rigid faith, proud lords, and city smallfolk who did not yet think of themselves as one people, all pushed in different directions. When Aegon could not be everywhere, when dragons could not be in two places at once, the shape of control would fall to whoever walked into trouble and cut it down to size. Visenya expected her son to be that person. Another turn deepened the lesson. When Aegon died, the court gathered in ash and ceremony. The dead king lay in armor, his mailed hands folded over Blackfire's hilt. Vhagar, the queen's dragon, lent her fire to the pyre, a final act of obedience to a brother. The old Valyrian rite held. Fire took flesh while steel endured. Afterward, the new king Aenys sought to bind his family in show and substance. He set the iron and ruby crown on his own head, then lifted Blackfire and placed it in his brother's hand, telling Maegor he was more fit to bear their father's sword. It was a generous miscalculation, and prudence became a spark. It was the blade of kingship by spectacle, the sword of pageants and proclamations. In that moment, Maegor held both ancestral weapons of their house, one given by his mother with stern purpose, the other by his brother in lavish trust. From that day, the histories tell us, Maegor chose Blackfire for the field and for show. Dark Sister hung on the walls of his chambers on Dragonstone. Consider what that image implies. The blade that moves fast, carves narrow verdicts, and expresses a policy of precise enforcement retires, for a time, to shadow and patience, while the broad sword of coronation strides out. It is not that Dark Sister's story ends there. It is that the sword seems to wait for a nature that suits it. Maegor, for all his force and future reputation, leaned toward the blunt tool of glory. He liked lines that ended in compliance. Dark Sister asked for a different kind of hand. Here the tension in the steel begins to show. Does a weapon shape its wielder, or do hands reach for the blade that flatters their own idea of themselves? Visenya's gift taught one answer. Aenys's bequest taught another. The realm would learn the cost of each. Maegor's reign, which lies ahead in this account, makes that plain, yet we do not need to leap there to sense the pattern forming. In the young days of the Red Keep, under a sky still crossed by 3 dragons, with masons hauling stone and courtiers learning to speak with one crown, Dark Sister had already stamped a definition on Targaryen governance. It linked proximity to accountability. It suggested that legitimacy failed without enforcement close at hand. It lived on a belt, not on a dais. Visenya's presence made all of that feel solid. Even those who loved her most, the record says, found her austere. She was not feared as a tyrant. She was respected as someone untouched by flattery and unmoved by tears. In a young kingdom where every conquered prince had a cousin nursing rebellion, that steadiness mattered. There is a difference between a queen who can hold an assembly with a smile and one who can end a dispute with a whisper and a tap of the scabbard. Both arts have their hour. The early Targaryen state needed both sisters, but the habits that endured through later crises, the habits that showed whom the blade favored, feel more like Visenya's than anyone else's. Rhaenys could light the sky. Visenya could make a city hold its breath. Her sword was not only a threat, though threat is part of governance. It was a steady reminder that power is personal. You can legislate from a throne, you can proclaim from a saddle, but closeness changes behavior faster. A guard's breath on your neck makes lying harder. A queen's unreadable gaze makes a lie clumsy. And a dark ripple at her hip ends the conversation. When we follow Dark Sister's later travels to Baelon, to Daemon, to Bryndon Rivers in the cold, we are really tracing how the Targaryens kept returning to this skill. The conversion of wide authority into immediate action. That is why this beginning matters. It is not just lore about a famous sword. It is the origin scene of a house preference. There is another reason to see Visenya's bequest as more than an heirloom passed down a hall. In a family that married within to keep dragons bound to their blood, mothers became powerful arbiters of style. The chronicles that hint at Visenya's darker experiments do so to stress her refusal to let chance decide the future. Whether or not she mixed tinctures in private, she mixed policy in public, and Dark Sister was her favored measure. Giving the blade to Maegor was a way to write a kind of future into a boy. It was not sentimental. It was structural. We speak of her as a builder of stone because a king set her to that work, and we can also credit her as a builder of a line because she chose the tool that would shape it. If this sounds clinical, it is because Visenya did not drape her decisions in poetry. That was Rhaenys' gift. Visenya could be tender in her own weathered way, but her tenderness looked like a hand on a shoulder that meant, stand up straight. Her trust, like her sword, cut toward clarity. She would not have called Dark Sister a symbol, though the court surely did. She would have called it a necessity, a thing required by the way the world resists order, unless order stands near enough to be felt. The king's guards' white cloaks soon became the visible extension of that lesson. They were the moving border of the king's body, 7 swords making sure the kingdom understood that there was a cost to casual approach. Their origin is a story about a tiny wound healing quickly, and the unhealed danger it revealed. It is as much about Visenya as it is about Aegon. In that cut is a philosophy we will see again, a belief that legitimacy without teeth invites chaos, and that steel used with restraint is a mercy compared to steel used late. Dark Sister's presence at the birth of that insight is not an accident. The sword does not confer a crown. It instead tightens the knot between authority and action. You can hear that logic echoed generations later when rebellious banners lift, and a Targaryen sends a man with that same lean blade to remove a head rather than draft a treatise. That habit begins here with a queen who trusted speed over ceremony and closeness over spectacle. Passing on the blade was more than keeping inventory. On Maegor's 13th name day, When Visenya laid Dark Sister across his palms, the steel became a matrilineal argument, a mother's lesson to rule like this when the time comes, to cut through fog, to let order breathe. The irony that followed when another sword, bright and broad, eclipsed Dark Sister in Maegor's grip, only sharpens the question we carry into the next chapter. If a blade can be patient, Dark Sister was patient in those years, hanging in a chamber on Dragonstone, while storms barked at the windows and the tide hurled itself against black rock. It waited for a hand whose reflex matched its balance. It waited for a ruler who read power as Visenya did, not as a distant light, but as a presence that polices its own borders. That leads to the enduring puzzle at the heart of this weapon's legend. Does a sword like Dark Sister choose by its own demands, calling for a temperament built for speed and decisive reach, or do parents and politics simply place it where they want that temperament to grow? We can find evidence both ways. A mother gives a blade to a son and shapes him. A brother gives a blade to a brother and tempts him. We return to Dark Sister in the lives of the most formidable Targaryens because its path runs the high ridge where those ideas meet. The steel wants what it wants. People want what they are asked to want. In that tangle, the realm discovers who will enforce its promises. For now, Visenya's edge sets the standard. She is a queen trained for war, carrying a swift dark sword. With a single nick, she convinces a king that presence is a duty owed to the body as much as to the realm. And she sets 7 white shadows to live at his side. She lays foundations in stone while she stands within the work with mud on her boots. She gives her son a blade that turns authority into the weight of a hand on a hilt. She accepts that fire takes flesh but not steel. She believes that order is born of closeness. When later names attach themselves to Dark Sister, they will be measured against this model. Some will exceed it. Some will exceed it. Some will refuse it. All will learn that the blade is less a relic than a reminder. When the chamber on Dragonstone dims in the damp evening and the sea murmurs through the arrow slits, you can imagine the sword on its hooks catching the last of the light. It is not brooding. Steel does not brood. It reflects instead. The woman who first set its image in Westerosi minds moved without waste, hid no warnings, and asked no forgiveness when steel could serve as policy. She walked the line between terror and trust with a steady foot. That line shapes Dark Sister's beginning, a cut that keeps cutting through centuries of argument over who should hold power and how close they should stand when they use it. The next hand reaches, the next test begins. The blade is ready. A funeral pyre burned on Dragonstone, and what rose from its heat was not only smoke but a problem. King Aegon was gone. Vhagar and the other dragons had added their breath to the flames. Maegor walked away with his father's sword, its dark ripples made darker by ash. Valyrian steel does not yield to common fire. That resilience, that refusal to yield, matched the mood of the moment. Soon after, Prince Aenys returned and put on the iron and ruby crown. In an act both gracious and calamitous, he drew Maegor to his feet and set Blackfire in his brother's hands. "You are more fit to bear this," he said, not knowing he was arming a principle as much as a man. From that day, something arresting happens. Maegor, who had already been gifted Dark Sister by his mother Visenya, owned both ancestral blades of House Targaryen, yet he chose only one. He strapped Blackfire to his side and never put it down, while Dark Sister was left to brood on the wall of his chamber on Dragonstone. The distinction reads like a thesis in metal. Blackfire is the public banner of rule, the theater of right and might displayed before the kneeling and the kneecap. Dark Sister is the blade for the closer act, the cut made in the narrow stair and the shadowed hall, the enforcement by touch. Maegor did not operate in corridors. He wanted a throne room. When King Aenys proclaimed that the realm would be ruled together, the gathered lords bowed and cheered, hearts softened by pageant and promise. Then the realm tested that fantasy. Rebellions gathered under the 7 stars. Doubts about succession thickened, and the crown that had gleamed in Aenys's hands looked like a question. Maegor did not answer with a question. He answered with a principle. The Iron Throne, he told the only man brave enough to object, will go to the man who has the strength to seize it. Then, with Blackfyre, he made that idea literal by taking the Grand Maester's head in one stroke. Even his crowning was an argument. He did not choose the ornate diadem Aenys favored, patterned with holy icons. He chose their father's iron crown, rubies like clotted blood across the brow. It was less a crown than a verdict. Here is the complication. A viewer might assume that the Targaryen blade of decisiveness would gleam brightest in the hands of the most brutal king. Yet the sword fashioned for swift action was not the one Maegor carried into his days. It hung, patient, on stone. This was not neglect born of ignorance. Maegor understood a blade. He had been the youngest knight in the Seven Kingdoms, dubbed on a battlefield with Blackfyre itself. At River Run, he had laid 3 white cloaks in the dust before losing only to the champion. He killed the giant of the trident with unembarrassed efficiency. He cut through pirates on the Stepstones with a terrible joy. Hand and eye were not his problem. Style was, for a man who believed rule to be a simple syllogism of strength. Blackfyre made the louder proof. Their name is a proclamation. It had been Aegon's war flag and his memory. When Blackfyre rose, people knew what was meant. It told every hall that the king was not in doubt. Dark Sister, by contrast, does not declare. It insinuates. It whispers the message of immediacy. It lives in the range where a ruler's breath brushes the ear of his subject. That is the realm where Visenya did her work, close enough to make fear efficient. Close enough to knit consequences to actions without a herald. Maegor did not knit, he hammered. He wanted every cut to be witnessed, each inch of blood proof that the law was the man and the man was law. So the narrower sword waited. It waited while Maegor strode through capital and countryside, putting down the faith militant with dragonfire and scaffold and steel. It waited while the incomplete Red Keep dug its tunnels and cellars deeper into Aegon's high hill. The work Visenya had watched over becoming the ground for a darker architecture. The hill was pocked with pits and foundations when Aenys led his retinue to see the project. After the funeral, he and his entourage went to King's Landing. The Aegon fort torn down around them, mud and rubble underfoot. In time, those foundations would hold dungeons, secret ways, and Maegor's own smaller fortress within a fortress. For such a king, the emblem mattered. If someone was going to be punished, if a message had to travel farther than a whisper, the blade he lifted could not be ambiguous. The point was not the cut, it was the sight of it. When Maegor returned from across the narrow sea on Balerion with his mother, the realm watched lines harden into factions. Queen Alyssa with her children was not there to see the iron crown lowered, but the room knew what it meant. By law, the aged said, the throne passed through Aenys to his son. By force, Maegor said, it passed through anyone whose neck did not bend. He did not argue the law's letters. He argued with the law's spine. Blackfyre was the spine he wanted the world to see. Dark Sister, perhaps, might have comforted another sort of ruler in those days. The kind who rules through doorways rather than squares. Instead, it looked down from its hook, thin and dark. A reminder that there is another way to enforce will that does not depend on how many are watching. There is a practical note here as well. Valyrian steel is both lighter and keener than common steel. It slides where other blades shove. It invites speed. The longer, broader sword that Maegor cherished projects weight. Blackfyre is a wall cutting forward. Dark Sister is a thread drawn through a knot. In peace, that difference would be academic. In a reign defined by terror as performance, it becomes policy. The king's arm became the stage, and Blackfyre the prop. If Maegor was the law, the blade had to be the seal, stamped in full view. He made sure there were always eyes to witness, so that the fear would travel faster than any raven. So we hold this picture in mind, a chamber on Dragonstone, stone damp as a cave, with a sword hung where torchlight cannot help but find it. The mother who gave it is absent from the capital, and the son who bears it does not reach for it. The kingdom heaves under a creed, stripped to muscle. The quiet edge is there, yet set aside. Does a sword shape a reign, or does a reign choose its sword? The answer may be yes, both ways, a loop of utility and preference. Dark Sister does not thrive on spectacle. It gathers legend in close work, when a rider drops from a saddle to take a head in the mud, or a prince slips through a postern gate and grants mercy or justice before anyone can draw a breath. That was never this king's creed. There is a paradox in his restraint. By never taking it up, Maegor keeps Dark Sister from taking on his kind of infamy. It is not innocent, yet it is not bound to his particular cruelty. He kills with black fire, rules with black fire, and loses with black fire. And when his reign finally ends, it is remembered with the Iron Throne more than with any blade. That more intimate sword survives the era like a line cut from a speech, an unsaid thought that lingers. In a dynasty fluent in the theater of power, an unused prop can be more dangerous than a bloodied one. Such a blade becomes story once more. Such a blade becomes story once more. It can be taken up by another hand without first washing away a stain that would define someone forever. After every overthrow comes an inventory. With Maegor gone and the realm breathing again, Jaehaerys' long order begins reclaiming roads and rebuilding trust. And what was Maegor's is counted and set in place. Blackfire remains the emblem of kingship, kept at the monarch's side by custom and story. Dark Sister, once a queen's gift to her son, returns to the royal stores. We are not told which vault received it, or which armorer tested its edge and nodded. Yet it is easy to picture a steward's hand meeting that rippled steel with practiced ease. These were not foreign treasures. They were family, and like family they waited in the rooms where decisions are made, part of the furniture of rule. From there, the blade's next public life narrows again, as if seeking the kind of movement that suits it. Later chronicles place Dark Sister on the hip of Prince Baelon Targaryen, called the Brave. It is a match of temperament to tool. Baelon is not a velvet prince. He is a rider and a roamer, raised in a court that repaired what the earlier sword had helped break. He marries quick love rather than slow alliance. He flies often, and he answers problems with presence. Where his father, Jaehaerys, perfects the craft of patient reconciliation from a throne, Baelon prefers the saddle and the next hill. For such a man, a narrow blade is an argument he can make in person. There is a deeper rhyme in that pairing. Vagar, the dragon Visenya rode, would one day carry Baelon too, old wings lifting a new intent. The echo matters. If Visenya's view of power was a hand on the realm's pulse, then Baelon inherits more than a sword. He takes a stance. He does not rule as a monarch. He serves as the monarchy's reach. When bandits grow bold on the road, or a lord tests the crown's patience by leaning on his small folk until they yield, a fast descent can settle matters in a day, not a season. A heavy sword is not wrong there, yet a quick one is right. Dark Sister turns action into clarity with less waste. Dark Sister turns action into clarity with less waste. It is also a family decision about image. Blackfire remains the pageant blade. Jaehaerys does not need to wave it in every hall, because his order rests on law more than raw fear. But the symbolism endures. Let the king hold the standard that reminds the kingdom of how it was won. Let the warrior's son bear the edge that reminds the kingdom power is not only spectacle. It is reach and timing, and the ability to appear where resistance believes itself unobserved. Allocating swords becomes a kind of allocation of roles. The father is the stage. The son is the step into the wings where the night crew works. Baelon's title, the Brave, is no boast. He earns it with quiet, stubborn courage, the kind shown by a man who expects to be first into a breach, and more dangerous for his enemies. First to arrive, before a breach even exists. In that world, Dark Sister is a companion whose message needs no explanation to those who receive it. A brief word, a quick fight, a problem settled without a letter sent. The sword serves less as a banner than as a key. It opens. It closes. It fits the narrow lock. When Balon rides away, there is nothing left to debate. The decision has already been made at arm's length. There is tenderness buried in this too. Balon is father to Viserys and to Daemon. They are boys with different weather in their eyes. One will grow into the mild warmth of compromise and consensus, the other into a storm that loves to find the open sea. It does not require prophecy to feel which of them the sword is looking at when it hangs from their father's hip. The lessons a boy learns from the curve of a weapon, from the way a hand rests on a hilt during council, or loosens for a jest at supper. Stay. Quick blade near a quick laugh rather than a long threat beside a long silence. But before we look too far ahead, hold the central turn we have crossed. In the reign most infamous for terror, the narrow sword is not the instrument of dread. It waits while the broad blade plays tyrant. That waiting complicates any easy claim that Dark Sister is simply a killer's tool. It is not a monster's favorite toy. It is a specialist's, and a specialist needs a problem that fits the tool. Maegor's problem was not close work. It was legitimacy, or the performance of legitimacy, which is something grand swords do better than small ones. He did not hide his crimes, and he did not hide his power. He wanted the world to see. Dark Sister, unlifted, became a reminder that some problems are solved more quietly than kings like to admit. So the blade seeks the kind of life it knows. From wall to vault, then from vault to warrior, it moves by taste and need. If black fire is the banner you recognize and salute, Dark Sister is the touch you feel and only later grasp. In Balon's hands, the blade hums again, like a well-made instrument when you find the right note. Faster than the public can whisper, a prince ends a dangerous quarrel in the Riverlands, or steadies a border by appearing overhead with Vhagar's shadow, and a sword so light it can be drawn and sheathed before any page can summon witnesses. We will trace that edge as it passes from father to son, and watch its character harden in the hand of the realm's most notorious prince. That comes later. For now we hold the image of Maegor's chamber, the hook and cold stone, and the choice not to choose. It was never about whether Dark Sister could cut. It was about the kind of cut Maegor wanted the realm to see. In that decision, the sword escaped a certain fate. It moved sideways in silence toward a rider who thought in swift acts and learned from the mother who first gripped the hilt, who taught the dynasty that speed, used at the exact right distance, can govern without a speech. Daemon Targaryen did not simply inherit Dark Sister. He finished a sentence that Visenya had begun. The blade passed from Balon's sure hand to a younger man who tested every boundary, yet knew in his bones what the steel was meant to do. He was the rogue prince, restless and magnetic, often the point of his own spear. In a court of masks, Dark Sister at his hip became plain speech. It was quiet where dragons were loud, close where banners stood far off, exact where proclamations scattered. With this blade, Daemon could act quickly and up close, and he kept that promise across reefs, courts, and battlefields. The sword's edge did not change. The hand around it did, and the realm felt it. The Stepstones gave him the first long canvas. The Triarchy had turned channels into counting houses, tying every hull to a ledger. Corlys Velaryon wanted currents unbound. Daemon wanted a war to fit him. On those rocks the tide was not just water but time, a pulse that kept men honest or drowned their mistakes. The fighting was not heroic in the way singers prefer. It was repeated landings in bad weather, knife work on stony paths, arrows taking men before a charge, the smell of salt and tar in every wound. Dark Sister looked like a lord's heirloom, but moved like a fisherman's knife, quick out of scabbard, Quick back in. Long before any crown of driftwood, the blade had already cut out small tumors of resistance, seamed by seamed, until the triarchy bled coin and patience. Daemon's legend in the islands grew from stubbornness more than spectacle. He learned sandbars and currents the way he learned habits of captains, and he used both, in cramped holds and beside narrow inlets. Dark Sister was the last thing counted by men who thought their ledgers would save them. The rogue prince arrived when signals and horns still fumbled, closed the distance on his own, and settled the matter. Kragas Drahar, the crab feeder, was not a story he solved in one leap. For years, the crab feeder salted fear on beaches by nailing men to stakes and letting the tide climb their ribs. When the two finally met without intermediaries, Daemon gave him no speech. Chroniclers differ on whether the prince hacked, hewed, or sliced. All agree someone carried what was left like a trophy back to camp. The work had taken seasons. The end took a moment. Dark Sister served as punctuation. Then came the crown without a kingdom, the bit of power Daemon made for himself. On the prow of a hard-used galley, sea wind in his hair, he accepted a circle of driftwood, and called himself King of the Narrow Sea. It sounded ridiculous to some and irresistible to others. A man could be king in truth if enough men bled and believed for him. For a while, they did. The sword at his side gave weight where the crown was light. It told every watcher that if the tide turned, the man would not. Yet as months stretched, the work of holding those islands looked less like glory, and more like tending a fire in a wet cave. The triarchy was not a dragon to be slain, but a house with many rooms. Even a rogue prince gets tired of the same door. Daemon, who had made a stage out of reefs, knew a better stage when he saw it. He sailed to King's Landing, walked into the throne room, and bent the knee before his older brother. He laid the driftwood at Viserys' feet, and let the court feel the jolt of an old quarrel turning into a performance of loyalty. It was real and not real at the same time. Forgiveness poured over him. Favors followed. In corridors where dragons could not be loosed, Dark Sister did the speaking for him, a constant reminder that the prince was an argument few wished to test. Men watched the sword as much as the man. It could end a whisper before it found a throat. It stood for a fact that politics is not just speech but the means to stop speech when it tries to take your place. The prince's life turned on a blade even when it was not a battlefield. Love, insult, and ambition braided into a single tight cord when he set his eye on Lyanna Velaryon. The Stepstones had taught him patience, but courtly obstacles wanted the other thing. An exiled Braavosi boy stood in his way, a betrothal written in ink but not yet bound in life. Daemon met him where he was strongest, not in law but in steel. He mocked him so savagely that the boy had to answer or live with the echo. They fought. The fight was not long. Dark Sister decided, as it often did. Within a fortnight, Daemon wed Lyanna, and the sea carried them far from a capital that never quite knew what to do with him. The move said as much about the man as about the blade. He did not wait to be assigned a place. He cut one. Those years of flight and return, of love gained and lost, of new vows and old feuds revived, placed Dark Sister in rooms where the cut would come in silence. The prince was a guest and a threat in the same breath. The sword made it simple. It was not a banner that needed distance to impress. It did not call trumpets. It hung low, breathed with his stride, and drew a circle in the air when he turned too quickly. Even men who liked him learned to leave more room than courtesy required. This is a kind of rule. A blade can enforce even when it sleeps, not by blood but by the promise that it can take the talk away. Daemon had discovered a method that Visenya would have recognized, and the court understood the lesson again. When the realm tore, the prince was already sharp. The dance of the dragons did not begin with a single step, but with a dozen feet placed in a familiar quarrel. Claims rose, oaths echoed, and the room for compromise closed like an iron door. Daemon chose a side, and gave it a point. With Caraxes under him and Dark Sister in hand, he became the instrument his princess needed. Raids began as lightning, messaging as pressure. He went where the cause bled, then went where the foe expected his absence most. Where dragons froze armies at a mile, the sword did the finishing at a yard, often out of sight of witnesses. The rogue prince was not just a terror in the sky. He was a surgeon on the ground. War is logistics and hunger, but it is also a man in a stairwell deciding whether to leave a rival the use of his tongue. Harrenhal became a statement. The castle was an old wound on the land, black stone that remembered fire. Daemon took it without a grand pitched battle, as if the ruin wanted to be his. He sat there a while, waiting in a seat carved by horror, and sent ravens down every river path, house by house, levy by levy. The riverlands bent toward the claim he served. His letters read like maps of obligation, but his presence read like intent. Men rode to him because he was the kind of leader who might win in a single afternoon, or at least change the meaning of losing. Once Harrenhal was his, Aemond One Eye seemed to circle it like a hawk that could not decide whether to stoop. That indecision had a cost. The rogue prince was not a man to leave a duel unwritten. Sometime between dispatches and raids, the politics turned to needlework. Revenge threaded through duty. The death of kin made the game personal, and Daemon did not pretend it wasn't. He harried, baited, withdrew, and lay in wait. He would not meet Vhagar in a straight sky until the stage was set. More than once he reached for victories that changed papers rather than fields. More than once his blade delivered terms in a cold room rather than on a warm plain. War is not only charge and countercharge, it is permission and denial, a door opening and a window closing. If Aemon wanted him, he would have to come to black stone and dark water. Letters crossed that were more like gauntlets. One prince claimed, the other accepted. The venue would be the god's eye. On that lake, the air carries rumors and swallows sound. Harrenhal squats like a burned memory on the shore, and the water below hides old cruelties. Daemon rode out over it on Caraxes, and Aemond came on Vhagar, older and more terrible. Small boats pulled in oars and watched from behind reeds. If the dance had a moment when everything it meant stood naked, it was there. Two riders on dragons above a black mirror, measuring debts they could not pay back in coin. You could say the blade was only a line in that sky, slender and human against mountains of scale. You could also say it was the only thing that mattered, because it was the only thing both men could bring to the same distance. The fight was not gallant. It was ugly and close. Caraxes moved like a whip, Vhagar like a landslide. They tore air and bit at each other, until the sky smelled like hot iron. When they locked, the scream of it made men forget their own names. In that tangle, Daemon closed the last gap no dragon could cross for him. He brought man to man. Stories say he leapt, or crawled across a neck, or flew on hate alone. What matters is that Dark Sister found the hole where an eye had been, and went hilt deep. Aemond stiffened on one saddle, while both dragons fell toward a black disk that rushed upward like a closing gate. Water rose in a white wall the height of a tower. Fisherfolk said nothing living could survive that. For a moment, Caraxes proved them only half wrong. He hauled himself out of the lake and died on the stones, the water around him hissing like a kettle. Vhagar sank, her hot blood boiling the surface as she went down. Later, after the war, when patience and luck had calmed the lake, men found her. Aemon's bones were still chained to the saddle. Dark Sister still jutted from the ruin where his eye had been. The image is hard to forget, a single stroke fixed in silt. Singers tried to dress it otherwise. They gave Daemon a secret old age and a girl to share it with. Even Mushroom, who loved a good lie, would not pretend this could be true. The prince who carried the blade to that height and made that choice did not walk away into a quiet field. The sword's disappearance begins where that scene ends. We can see it in two clear frames. First, the moment of impact, the blade lodged where it was aimed, the hilt slick with lake water as the dragons vanished. Second, the slow work of years, when men with hooks and nets and nerve hauled bones and memory from the deepest part of the god's eye, and found what the fall had fixed. At some point after the dance, those searchers looked on a skull with a gash, on ancient chain, and on Valyrian steel, set like a nail in history. How that, the record fades. Was the sword drawn on the shore and passed to a messenger? Did a diver's hand rise with it, through weeds and stories, to a steward of Harrenhal, or to a sworn man of the crown? We have lists of reparations and fleets, and a crown that had to build a peace out of cinders. What we do not have is a single line that says who took the hilt or where he went. The uncertainty is not a failure. It is an invitation. When steel crosses that much water and leaves no signature, we look for the place where paper thins and quiet men begin to matter. Lords of the Riverlands had claim, if only for proximity. The crown had claim by right. Valyrian captains had the means, if charts and courage were enough. Harrenhal was held and lost and held again, and in each holding a new steward, locked a new chest. The times were full of commissions and inquisitions, and in that noise, a single wrapped length could travel under seal, without anyone daring to lift a cloth. The question of chain of custody is as much about who needed it as who earned it. If a blade is a sentence, it requires the next mouth that can speak with it. There is a tension here that suits the sword. Dark Sister is at its best when it is close. When a rider lands, a door shuts, and breath fogs between rivals. To pull it from the eye socket of a dead prince and give it a new task required someone who valued that sort of conversation, not the pageant of a tourney field. The years after the dance raised and ruined such men. Some preferred the story told by a greatsword held high. Others built their work in rooms where no bard was invited. When the blade surfaces again in the chronicles, it will be in the hands of a man whose gifts fit the steel, who used whispers the way others used charges. Before we reach him, the investigative path leads through spools of parchment, past men who thought in ledgers and men who thought in consequences. Consider motives. A regency wants symbols it can control, not legends that walk on their own. A lord who fishes greatness from a lake wants to be thanked in coin and favor, and may not care about the story until it knocks on his gate. A hand trying to tighten a weak king's grip wants tools that do not need a trumpeter. In this fog, small choices become the current. A captain stops at a different quay. A steward answers a raven instead of the man at his door. A castellan with a strong box decides whose name belongs on the chit. None of that makes a ballad, yet together they redirect a river. If Dark Sister teaches anything in this chapter, it is that decisive acts often disappear into bureaucracy without losing their edge. What we can say with confidence is that the sword did not sleep forever under that black water. The lake kept dead secrets, but it could not keep Valyrian steel from a family that had built a throne on dragonfire and close work. The prince who sank with his enemy left no sons to claim the hilt, but the dynasty had cousins and councils, and men whose only birthright was their usefulness. Step back and the pattern holds. Visenya's blade found Visenya's heirs in spirit rather than in line. It wanted a hand quick to choose, quicker to act, most comfortable when argument ends at a whisper. The rogue prince made the sword louder than it had been in a century, then drowned it in a statement only a Targaryen could write. The next hand would not be a rogue so much as a reckoner. We leave the god's eye with images rather than answers, a shattered saddle in the silt, chain clinging to bone, a hilt that does not rust. On shore, steam drifted and stones cracked in the dragon's heat. In the years to come, men crossed those shores looking for money, relics, or absolution, and some of them found all three in a single day. Somewhere in that traffic, the blade moved from water to air to cloth to another man's belt. To follow it from this point, We cannot stand on walls and watch banners tilt. We have to drop into the channels of post-war power, where letters mattered more than lances and memory could be managed like a crop. There, in the shadow between what was recorded and what was done, Dark Sister will rise again, quiet as ever, ready to finish another sentence. The lake gave up the blade, but the ledgers stayed silent. Months turned to years after the god's eye, and the weapon that felled a prince beneath a storm of wings slipped from the record of war into the quiet of clerks and chambers. Then, as if rising from another depth, the chronicles return with a name: Brynden Rivers, Bloodraven. A royal bastard who became the king's most dangerous secret. Later accounts placed Dark Sister at his hip, a narrow sliver of night beside a man who seemed made of winter light. The reappearance is not staged in a triumphal hall. It comes as rumor hardened by repetition, the sort of detail scribes include without pause, because it feels inevitable. Of course that sword found him. Of course the blade that kills at arm's reach chose a man who ruled with whispers and a cold, exacting hand. Brynden Rivers came to power from the margins, and he never forgot what the edges can do. He was one of King Aegon the Unworthy's many sins given breath. Yet unlike his half-brother Daemon Blackfyre, he did not answer that scandal with pageantry. He wore it like armor and learned to look past it. Pale as drifted snow, with one eye dark and the other red, and a wine-stained birthmark shaped like a raven's wings across his cheek, he took his nickname from a boast, and then made the boast come true. 1,000 eyes and one. One he would admit to, the other 1,000 he would let you feel. He read the realm the way some men read a face, counting market fires, the paths of ravens, and the coughing of old lords. He knew what time alone could do to a prince, and he knew that the shortest line from power to result is often drawn in a small room. Dark Sister fit that geometry. Before the legends of corridors and ravens were codified, his arrows had already chosen him a place in the story. The first Blackfyre rebellion came like a fever born in a love story. One more unwise gift made iron. The great sword Blackfyre, which a wiser king might have held tight, became a banner for a rival house that should never have been born. Fantastical titles and rich promises roused the riverlords and stormlords into hard choices, and fields rolled with men who thought war would carry them to honor. Over that honor, Bloodraven raised the raven's teeth. His longbowmen took a ridge and laid it with weirwood shafts, white and unreal, then waited with cold patience. The rebel host broke against the crown's line from the front and the flank, and when the gap opened, his archers sent a rain that punished courage itself. It was not a fair fight as chivalry measures fairness. It was a victory measured by mothers spared. When songs tell it, Daemon Blackfyre and his heirs died in that fall of shafts. The black dragon pierced and the standard cut down like any cloth. When bards need an image for cruelty or wisdom, they find one in that white hail under a gray sky. Late in the day, the enemy's dead lay like scales torn from a serpent, and the last living point of their cause tried to carve a way out. Aegon Rivers, called Bittersteel, turned for one more wound. Accounts agree that he found it. They say he fell upon Brynden Rivers in a clash that was more scythe than dance, and when they tore apart again, one of Bloodraven's eyes was gone. The duel becomes a mirror in retrospect, two bastards from the same ruin wearing different answers to the same question. Who gets to decide what a king is? After Redgrass, one fled east with a sword that shouted blood rights, and the other stayed with an office that did not speak at all. At his belt in memory, if not yet in law, lay a Valyrian blade cut to end arguments up close. Power adjusted itself to that day. The rebellion broke, and the crown learned that a man who sees danger before it speaks is worth more than 1,000 banners after. Brynden Rivers did not quit the ridge. He simply moved it indoors. He rose first as a counselor, then Hand of the King, under Aerys I, a monarch more in love with pages than people. Bloodraven made the realm governable while his king read. He built an invisible lattice over the 7 kingdoms, a net of lesser eyes and greater ears. Taverns, docks, septs, and counting houses near enough thrummed when he passed. The words 1,000 eyes, and one, became an answer to any whisper. No one should have known. He was feared for informants and darker rumors, as his Aunt Visenya had been in Aegon's day. The world had already met a queen who played with poisons and dabbled in dark sorceries, and carried Dark Sister without apology. This nephew did not need spells to seem uncanny. He needed proximity, proof, and a sword perfect for decisions that cannot bear witnesses. The Tale of White Walls shows the method in full. A tourney dressed in silk hid a coup dressed in prayer, a comfortable hall for a quiet coronation. Lords with old grudges and new debts gathered to tilt lances while a black fire with poets' bones rehearsed a speech, meant to unmake a king. Bryndon's answer arrived before the crown itself could see the trap. Retainers disappeared into the lists under false colors. Messengers never reached their stables. A dragon's egg that was meant to bless a new reign instead betrayed its buyer. When the hand finally came in person, ravens circled the pale winter sun, and the castle's stone became a throat closing. Bloodraven unmasked the plot, named conspirators, and put the question of mercy to the sword in the old hard way. Castle was torn down after, a warning built from absence. The royal writs that followed were clean and civil, but no one who had watched that day up close forgot the other half of governance. It happens in cellars. It happens in rooms without windows. It happens within a sword's reach, where Dark Sister speaks loudest. Across these years, the blade's presence is both ornament and oath. The hand does not ride at the head of a charge with a showy broadsword like Blackfire, not when the work is sifting rumor from treason and treason from fear. Dark Sister's form appeals to the hand that must decide where to cut a knot, rather than display the rope. If a lordling refuses the truth of a sealed letter, the slender Valyrian steel at Bloodraven's side turns disbelief into hazard. If a jailer balks at opening a door at midnight, he hears the whisper of a legend walking, and remembers that no common fire mars that metal. The sword confirms what the rumors promise. Here is power that is not performed, it is applied. It is not an emblem for a hall, it is a threat for a desk, a landing, a stair. This approach makes enemies that cannot be dueled. They do not rush a field. They collect arguments, then wait for the realm's patience to run out. The turning point arrives not on a ridge, but at a council. After years of Blackfire embers pulsing across the sea, a claimant came west under the shade of words kings are supposed to honor. Safe conduct. There is no poetry to what happened next. Bryndon Rivers took the man and ended his line with legal economy. Some call it kinslaying, others call it prudence. Everyone calls it the last unarguable decision he made his hand. The realm tolerates 1,000 eyes when those eyes warn of a fire. It grows uneasy when they judge the flame's purpose and snuff it indoors. For that choice, Bloodraven was condemned, then reappointed to a different kind of watch. At the wall, the world narrowed to a single line, north and south with little between. He swore the night's watch vows and rose, as he always had, until the black cloak held the weight of command. Surviving accounts carry the same clear edges. Ravens flew where he sent them. Rangers marched with fewer songs and more ropes. Letters in a hard winter hand tell of supplies arriving before they were needed, of a spring with fewer bodies along the milkwater, of eyes in the wood that stared back, and then did not return. The name Bloodraven turned again, as names tend to do. To his brothers he was the old commander who counted fires at night, and sent men where silence began to feel wrong. Was Dark Sister with him on the wall? Most chroniclers who note his going say yes, with the easy assurance of people who see patterns. If the crown did not pry the blade from Maegor when he hung it on his chamber wall, if it returned to Visenya's kin after Demon fell into the god's eye, if it found the hand who turned rebellion into paperwork, then the sword had already shown it would follow function, not the hall. There is good sense in letting a sworn brother keep a weapon he knows, especially at the end of the world. There is also sense in sending a volatile symbol far from courts that have had enough of symbols. The record is not a list of locks and chests. It is a tone, and that tone says the sword went north. On the wall, the blade's legacy uncoronated itself. It no longer skirted the gowns of pretenders. It encountered a frontier that did not debate charters. Close work became different work. In a tunnel with hoarfrost on the stones, a blade that was born under dragonfire made a new kind of sound. Blackfire had always been a banner for a claim. Dark Sister, in Bloodraven's hand, became a seal pressed against a door you do not want opened. Brothers spoke, in the vague way soldiers do, of a thin black edge that did not pit or pale, of a commander who did not waste it on shows. When a ranger earns that kind of rumor, it means there were nights when no one else could afford to be nearby. Then the commander went into the trees and did not come back. The ranging that swallowed him reads like a template you can place over a dozen vanished men, and yet it leaves a sharper silhouette because of who he was. Some dates put the departure at a time when southern kings turned over and turned again. The watch has its own calendars, and they do not always speak to ours. We know he left with a small company. We know the snows that year were not unusually cruel, which can be a worse omen than the opposite. We know the last man to see him at the gate said he carried less than most commanders and looked stronger. All else is the forest at dusk. It keeps its stories. What becomes of a sword at such a line? There are brothers who will tell you that nothing of value vanishes from Castle Black without a quarrel and a list. They can produce neither for Dark Sister. There are stewards who will speak of inventories that leave off too soon, as if the quill grew tired. In the snatches of testimony that remain, you find the phrase "a black scabbard with silver rings," logged once beside a crate of lantern oil, then never again. It proves nothing, and that emptiness is its own evidence. When the man who wore the 1,000 eyes stopped sending eyes back, the habits of quiet he had taught the watch did the rest. The theories split like wind around stones. 1. If Dark Sister did not ride into the haunted forest on Brynden Rivers' shoulder, then it lies in a castle that has changed captains, patched roofs, and even its spelling over 100 winters, never finding the one secret its keepers most wanted. That is possible, but it does not feel like the Sword's Tale. But it does not feel like the Sword's Tale. If the blade did go beyond with its keeper, it met the only question that has ever truly mattered to Valyrian steel. Can time break it without fire? And can silence hide it longer than fame can carry a search? The traits that once kept Blackfire from a pyre remind us this metal endures. We do not know what endures with it. Another kind of speculation listens not to records but to rhymes. It says a watcher who turns to shadow will lay down any weight that does not belong to the roots. The forest will allow a man to keep a memory, but not a weapon that remembers others. In those tales, the sword meets a pocket of time and does not come back. Not because it cannot, but because a choice was made where choices endure. Brynden Rivers as Bloodraven becomes something else in northern mouths, a pale lord with 1,000 birds and one red eye, seated in a tangle of white moving men without moving himself. In such a picture, a narrow blade is a stranger, yet the men he moved were cut by something. The old problem returns. We are trying to prove an edge by the wound it leaves in air. What we can say, stepping back into the discipline of ink and wax, is that Dark Sister's path through Bloodraven's life clarifies the sword's meaning in Targaryen politics. With him, it stops being a sign of blood inheritance and becomes a tool for enforcement. It lives on ridges and in trapdoors, in letters that ride before lords wake, and in the single instant when a choice is no longer a debate. The Blackfire cause taught us that spectacle can claim a people. Bloodraven taught us that governance survives by outlasting the need for applause. The blade he wore, therefore, grows itself a character. It prefers hands that do not shake and rooms that do not echo. Its legend, in this era, is not a cheer. It is an intake of breath. And yet, that breath holds a question. If this sword follows function, not blood, what does it prefer when the function changes from keeping kings safe to keeping the human world intact against a different kind of night? Bloodraven carried it from dynastic fights to the end of all roads. If he left it behind at the wall, then the watch that he bent toward order may still hold a quiet ace among its hardened relics. If he carried it past the last burned tree, then the North has one more secret buried under its white skin. In either case, the sword's reputation shifts. It is no longer only the sister to a conqueror's great blade or the edge in a prince's desperate leap. It becomes a sentinel's tool. We have reached the last trace we can trust. A man who knew too much to die easy walked north under a sky that did not care what crowns men wore. The iron he carried, blacker than a raven's back, kept pace with him. To find the weapon now, we must sift through cold rumor and lean into the wind off the shivering sea. We must weigh which silences hide treasure and which guard graves. We must ask how often a blade that loves the tight margin of a heartbeat will endure centuries of muffled snow. We are ready to follow the disappearing line from the wall into the forest, to test every glint and whisper for a shape as thin as judgment. We have reached the cold edge of the map, where the paper thins and the ink gives way to ice. This is where the question finally waits. Where is Dark Sister now, and what does its long shadow tell us about Targaryen power, and the price paid to hold a realm together? We have names and battles behind us, a trail of smoke and salt, and a final wielder whose talent for control ran colder than steel. Brynden Rivers, the hand-turned watchman, took the blade that had settled arguments in halls and fields, and carried it toward a war no council wished to name aloud. The problem is that our firm line ends at the wall. First, the cannon bounds. On the page, Dark Sister is last seen at the belt of Brynden Rivers during his years as the hard-eyed steward of the Targaryen crown. He uses it openly on the Redgrass field. He uses it again when he tears the mask from a false king at White Walls, and when he makes the kind of choice that keeps dynasties alive and songs angry. Later, he is forced to take the black. On the page, he becomes a brother, then Lord Commander, and is recorded as vanishing on a ranging. In another book, under another title, he appears again beyond the wall, an old man grown into a weirwood throne who has traded one eye for 1,000. He is named plainly as Brynden Rivers. Nowhere in that later meeting does the text place Dark Sister in his hand, or even in the Room of Roots. We are left with 3 scenarios that matter. First, that Rivers left Dark Sister at the wall, perhaps in the Castle Black Armory, or hanging in the Lord Commander's solar as a ward and a warning. Second, that he carried it on his last ranging and lost it in the wilderness between the mountains and the lake, swallowed by snow, by a foe, or by both. Third, that he brought it underground into the Greenseer caves, setting the blade at the threshold of a war, not fought with lances and banners, but with watching, memory, and the old powers that do not march. Each scenario can be tested against the grain of the text, against habit, and against the stubborn logic of iron that does not rust. Consider the wall. The Night's Watch keeps thin ledgers and bears bruised pride, yet some objects do not pass in silence. When Maegor the Cruel wore both Valyrian blades in his youth, the chronicle notes that he set one aside. It tells us, without flourish, that Dark Sister hung on the walls of his chambers on Dragonstone, while he chose Blackfire for his hand. That is how Valyrian steel appears in a record. It is not a blur. It is a detail scribes keep because it says something about a man and his rule. If Rivers had hung Dark Sister on the Lord Commander's wall, or set it by the Black Gate like a promise, we would expect an echo in a book, a remark that the Watch, for once, held a sword the realm would envy. The old bear's words lean the same way. The Night's Watch has become an army of sullen boys and tired old men, Lord Commander Mormont tells Tyrion. a man who knows how to count and cannot deny the math. He laments deserters, men missing on rangings, the slow fall of summers when the watch built instead of bled. He makes no mention of a relic blade that could have rallied men or made lords look north with more than pity. Later, when Stannis comes in fire and stubbornness, Jon Snow and the king argue over who truly holds the title that matters. The Watcher on the walls, the sword in the darkness, Jon says. Stannis lifts Lightbringer, bright and theatrical. Here is your sword in the darkness. If Dark Sister sat anywhere in Castle Black within reach, that exchange would ring differently. The Watch would not borrow a king's illusion to make its point. It would point to its own black steel and let the weight speak. Material logic points the same way. Valyrian steel endures. It holds an edge, resists the brown dust of time, and announces itself in a room even in quiet. If Dark Sister had been left on a rack at Castle Black, a boy would have whispered to another, a steward would have slipped a rumor to a passing lord, and the blade would have surfaced when it could have mattered most. When Longclaw appears, a single sword changes a young commander's odds and his mind. Jon notices its speed, its balance, its ability to bite. We feel what Valyrian steel does in a fight. The story is sensitive to such things. The silence around Dark Sister at the wall reads as absence, not discretion. The armory theory is the weakest, and it demands more explanation than the page can support. It asks us to believe a proud, endangered order accepted a legendary sword, then never spoke of it, not even in the private moments when a man tries to believe his years meant something. It also runs against River's pattern. He was not a giver of weapons that decide lives. He hoarded leverage and kept his sharp tools close. The second theory, the loss beyond, begins with a plain truth. Bloodraven did not go into White Woods to die quietly. He believed the true war waited north of every comfortable chair he had ever held, and he was willing to be hated to prepare for it. The Ranger's Road has blank places where a song might fit, but no singer followed, and the Watch has lost men to those distances again and again. One deserter and 2 men lost, and now Ben Stark too has gone missing, the old bear says, and the air in the room tightens. It is not hard to picture Rivers' last prince dragged under trees and drift. It is not hard to picture hands that cannot write pulling a rare blade from a dead man's belt, then slipping back into the human map behind the wall that does not always cross back over. Yet a lost sword of that quality tends to make new stories. Free folk names rise and fall in the South, but we hear some of them more than once. We see their habits. The Thens value bronze, Rattleshirt wears bone. Tormund trades in boast and warmth. The chief who found the Black Prince's thin sword would discover how much easier it is to hold a crowd when the blade in your hand slides without a whetstone. That kind of advantage trickles south in rumor, if not in steel. We might have heard of a raider with a dark singing sword that never needed oil, of a crow killer who carried a prince's tooth. We have not. There is also the strange quiet logic of the others in the dark. We do not know, on the page, what cold magic does to Valyrian steel. We know only that old spells sit in the metal. We know it drinks light, gleams, and does not care about rain. The blanks in that knowledge do not help the lost theory. They make it possible, but they do not make it persuasive. The sword is hard to destroy and easy to beautiful. It tends to persist. If it slid beneath a frozen pond or into a snow-choked crevice, it might sleep a century and come up bright. But the narrative we are intends to show us when such sleeping princes stir. This one has not. The third theory coils around character, habit, and the role Rivers chose at the end. It says he brought Dark Sister under the earth. By the time Bran meets him, Brynden Rivers is more root than man, a voice threaded through the memory of the trees. The cave where he sits is warded against the dead. It is a place where iron and blood do not count for as much as names and sight. The children of the forest who tend him favor obsidian knives and bone. The boy is shown dragon glass. He is not shown a famous sword. On first glance that hurts the cave theory. Look harder and it steadies. Rivers does not draw blades to impress students. He draws them to end moments he cannot afford to let run. In the cave he no longer walks roads where steel has the last word, but he has not forgotten what roads are. He would know that iron offends the singers, and that Valyrian steel is still a kind of iron, however much magic a long-dead empire burned into it. He would also know that symbols manage men. Power is a curious thing. Varys once said as a shadow argument to a man who preferred wine to war, "He has neither crown, nor gold, nor favor of the gods, only a piece of pointed steel." Rivers understood that axiom well before the eunuch spoke it. He was the man who put on a brocade of ravens and turned a kingdom with a secret or a blade when each was needed. He would bring his last sharp symbol with him to the last border. The cave is not a single chamber. It is a city of roots. Bran's window is narrow, and he sees only what he must to learn. Some halls no man will ever enter. There are cold antechambers where iron can wait out of sight, spared the singer's scorn, yet close to the one man who may send it on an errand through a living hand. Cold Hands, the unnatural ranger who guides the children, carries no sword. He is the spear, and he is patience. That does not break the cave theory. It matches Rivers's method. You keep the one irreplaceable thing out of the snow until the moment to risk it. Then you place it in the hand that can do what must be done. You do not spend it on daily chores. You do not spend it on daily chores. You do not strap it to a corpse that never draws breath. This is how the blade has behaved under men like him before. Dark Sister spends less time at banquets than other Valyrian swords. Blackfire is a hall speech turned into steel. Ice was a public altar built into a blade, then broken and reborn into bright props for kings who needed red optics. Heartsbane lives in a lord's pride and cupboard, Longclaw crossed bear to wolf, a pragmatic gift that became a destiny. Dark Sister is different. It shuns the feast. It appears beside enforcement, between a whisper and a verdict. Ilms to those who keep the edge of the law as tight as a garrote, and to those who wander outside the line and make sure the path remains available. Visenya rides at the side of her brother and makes men choose to bend before she forces them down. Maegor hangs it on his wall while he bullies the realm with another sword. A telling aside that the quiet blade does its greatest work in private. Belon carries it between mountains and vulture-haunted passes. Daemon takes it to the streets, to brothels and steps slick with rain, to sky duels no council could bless. Brynden Rivers ends the pattern by honing it almost invisible. So we weigh the three and name the third most likely. Rivers took Dark Sister north because he took everything that mattered north. He did not leave the single most eloquent piece of his will in a rack where boys with cold fingers would gawk. He did not lose it to a campfire song. He took it into the cave to wait with him, because he knew that if steel is power, it is also a story. And stories can travel farther than bones. The blade's silence is classic Rivers. It is what a spy master does with the last weapon he trusts. He places it behind the curtains of a stage most men do not know exists, and lets the audience feel the threat without seeing the knife. If we are wrong, and we must admit the inch where we might be, then the lost beyond would be next. The armory theory stays least credible. It reads like wishful housekeeping. The farther north answer pays respect to materials, to habit, and to the way George R.R. Martin's world handles relics. Revered objects crave echo. They leave craftsmen's marks on the ledgers of culture. Their absence argues for exile, not clerical error. Even the strongest walls leak fame. Castle Black is not strong enough to keep a secret sword secret for so long. Not when lords visit, kings camp, and crows slip letters with small boasts. That brings us to meaning. The object is a path, not a trophy. Dark Sister is the blade most often carried by Targaryens who enforce rather than adorn. It favors the belt of a woman who will set a king straight in the corridor. It rests in the hand of a prince who smiles like a thief. It answers the fist of a spymaster who prefers records to banners. It gravitates to in-between places and to moments when a split second decides the realm's next year. That is why it keeps falling into the hands of men and women who work at the edges. It is not a crown. It is a key. And keys live at thresholds. The watch is the oldest threshold in the story. In their black, the oaths reduce power to its blunt form. No land, no children, no personal glory, only a line to stand. When Jon recites "The Watcher on the Walls, the Sword in the Darkness," he names a duty so spare that even a king tries to claim it with a prop. Stannis raises Lightbringer and says, "Here is your sword in the darkness," believing that light persuades better than a ration book. The Watch could have used Dark Sister as a true answer to that gesture. A piece of pointed steel that asked for nothing other than obedience and fear. They did not, which tells us it was not theirs to brandish. By tracing the blade from Visenya to Rivers, we discover a second map. The Iron Throne matters, but not because it is a chair that grants an aura like Lightbringer in a cold hall. It matters because men and women with will decide where the chair's shadow falls. Why do we pretend our kings hold the power? Varys asks, and he lets the question point at the swordsman. The truth in the riddle is not that crowns are lies. It is that crowns are contracts drawn up in the same ink as fear, habit, and sharp edges. Dark Sister belongs to those who police the contract when the party threatens to get out of hand. Again and again, that has not been the seated king. The sword's likely resting place carries that lesson forward. Forward. If Dark Sister still waits, it most likely waits where maps end and watchfulness hushes speech, in a root dark chamber behind wards old as dawn. It may lean by a wall of living wood in a place no black rook will ever catalog. It may lie across the lap of bones that once wore Bryndon's furs, set beyond the places where the singers allow iron to sleep, kept still for a man whose tools turned to thoughts before he slipped beneath the tree. That answer is modest in spectacle and rich in sense. It follows the same logic that made the sword valuable in alleys and war rooms, not at tourneys. If a day comes when the cave empties and the snow around the dark door shows the scuff of a boot that breathes, the sword could walk again. The sword could walk again. The story allows for it. Valyrian steel resists time and leaves room for late returns. The tale does not promise it. It allows it the way it allows a winter raven to find its old roost after storms. The uncertainty preserves the right flavor, keeps Dark Sister dangerous, because it means the blade could intrude on any moment when some border keeper must trade the abstract for the immediate. We are meant to feel the lack more than to resolve it. In that sense, this was never a whodunit that ends behind glass. It was a slow revelation of how Targaryen power lived when it was not being celebrated. The family ruled from a chair, yes, but it held its grip through corridors, prison yards, duels in the sky, bridges in the rain, and the margins where one wrong whisper could topple a whole festival. The men and women who wielded Dark Sister best understood that. They paid for it, each in their own way, by losing something a king expects to keep. Visenya traded softness. Maegor traded love. Balon traded his life young. Daemon traded safety and peace. Bryndon Rivers traded himself until there was little left but a voice. So the last image we hold is not a crown. It is a narrow blade waiting in the one place where waiting matters. The sword's path closes a loop the realm keeps trying to ignore. Hard power is shaped and enforced from its edges, and the firmest hands, the ones that choose last resorts with care, often do their work far from the cheers in the sunlight. If you want to know who should wield it, or who will, follow the people who live at the border between warning and act. Follow the ones who can set a halt to rights with a whisper, then walk the wall in the dark with a single tool and a plan. That has always been Dark Sister's company. That is where it is most itself. And that is where it is most likely to be now, out of sight, balanced between danger and duty, asking nothing, waiting to be needed.